people say, you know, how do you get inspiration? I mean, there's no such thing as inspiration. And I was fortunate when I was a student, I met Francis Bacon. It was the first time I met a really serious artist. And we had a mutual friend called Robert Bueller, who was one of my tutors at Royal College. And he said, you must meet Francis. He's lecturing this year. He'll be one of your tutors this year. Let's go and see him. So I went into the studio, and I was, you know, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but the place was chaotic. It reeked of paint and turps and so forth, and the floor was littered with sand because he was using a lot of sand in his paintings. It's the first time I'd ever been in a serious artist's painting studio, and he asked me sort of questions, like very guided. Said, you know, who are you? Well, you're a student. Yes, I'm a student. You're a painter. I said, I think so. He said, well, either you know or you don't know whether you're a painter. You know, you must make up your mind. And I thought, my God, I must watch what I'm saying. He said, no, you can talk. You can talk to me. You say anything you like. And so we talked. We talked for a long time. He'd say things like, what are you painting? I said, I'm painting a still life. He said, what's a still life? I mean, he knew what a still life was, but the way he was getting at me, what is a still life? I said, well, you get it. He said, I know what it is. I know what a still life is. He said, what are you doing that for? I said, because I had to do one for the end of year examinations. He said, oh, rubbish. You know, don't do that. He said, how old are you? I said, I'm 20. He said, do you speak French? Do you speak any languages? I said, no. He said, don't you? He said, oh, it must be terribly difficult for you. I said, why? Why would it be difficult not being able to speak French or German? He said, you'll see later perhaps, if you're lucky. And went on this kind of vein. He said, you paint what you are. And he said, you have to go to the theatre, you have to go to the cinema, you have to read books, you have to learn the language, and appreciate other cultures. These are things you have to do. You don't just stand at your easel all day. It's a waste of time. You know, you've got to put stuff up here, you know, and use your heart and your intelligence to decide what to do. And said, don't look at other people. Don't try and emulate anybody else. He said, it'll take time, but this is what, you know, and no one had ever spoken to me like this. And so it was. So I had, you know, several meetings with him during that year that he was there for about 7 or 8 months. He said, "I'm going to my club." He said, "What time do you get up?" I said, "Oh, I don't know, about 8 o'clock." He said, "I start painting at 6." And I looked. He said, "You think I'm joking?" He said, "You see me wandering off to the pub at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for my Guinness and oysters of the day." I said, "You think I'm?" He said, "You have to work at it. You have to put the time in, you know." So he gave me a work ethic, which I've retained ever since. I've always worked. I've always had a place to work. He said, "You must have somewhere to work." And no way could I question his integrity or his he was a prolific painter and serious. And I took a lot of, you know, it really changed the way I looked at painting. And I thought, you know, the sky's the limit. You can do all sorts of things, you know. I was so keen, being a sort of a very young student in a big senior art school, really hoping that I'd survive the course, 3-year course. And I was, you know, doing my best to wash my brushes and keep them really neat and tidy and so on. But it was really only meeting a really serious painter and other painters later on that I realised that I was really on the wrong route, really. The studio was interesting because we were expected to keep our spaces reasonably tidy and clean, and this was absolute chaos. Paint all over the floor. There was a chaise longue which looked like someone had been gutted. You know, the red paint all over it, and entrails, and it was covered in sand, and he was using it as a palette, and using his hands on the canvas. And I thought, I never thought that you were allowed to use your hands on a painting. You see. Because I've been brought up in a very correct way by people who were professional teachers of art and professional teachers of painting in particular, usually. And they had their own eyes. You always kept your brushes clean, you know, and you washed them at the end of the day and you licked them to make sure they were clean and licked them into the shape and put them in a container so that you could go in next day and everything would be tidy. And there was this man, he had brushes stuffed into old baked bean tins and hundreds of brushes just rammed in, all dirty. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is a bit different. He said, come, we'll go to the Colony Club. I mean, it was full of sort of famous artists. It was unbelievable. It was a private club, but it was open during the day and during the afternoon when all pubs were closed. It was full of critics and painters and writers and so forth. It was just, you know, for a 20-year-old sort of suddenly introduced into this kind of environment. And he said, enjoy it. He said, you know, everything's on the house. And at the end, he said, "Your taxi's waiting." He put me in a taxi, and drove me back to my digs. But apparently, he did that to other people too. There were several other painters who recently I've been reading about their early years, and they all mentioned Francis Bacon and how he helped them. And so it was really, I never realised that. So he was a very considerate person. Materials make a difference. When acrylics came in, you're presented with a different kind of opportunity, because the paints, they say, are permanent. They do not fade, they do not crack, they dry as quickly as you want them to. They can dry very quickly, or you can slow them down with various other emulsions and sprays. So you've got a very different kind of time scheme when you're actually doing a painting. With oils, the paint's going to be sticky for 2 or 3 days. You can wear over paint, it's going to be okay. With acrylic, if it's a hot day, you're doing one piece up here, and you look down and that bit's dried, and you can't scrape it off. Once it's dried, it's really hard. So if you're working on canvas, it's good because it's flexible, but it retains its colour, and you've got the advantage of having colours like copper. You've got metallic colours, copper, bronze, silver, and these give another sort of colour dimension to the painting. You could do anything with it, and it kept its freshness. You could make an acrylic paint look like an oil paint. Oil paint is just absolutely, you can fool anybody if you use it in a certain way, because the medium determines how you put the paint on. With acrylics, it certainly has advantages, and whereas before you'd have to think, I have to put size, Arabic glue size on, and I have to use my white lead, and I have to put a special gesso on, and then I have to, the preparation, you never got around to painting. You spend half your time just worrying about the technique. With this acrylic, you can forget about technique and just put the paint on, and that has a liberating effect, because you can generate ideas and images very spontaneously. And I must say that I really like the look of that heavy impasto, that sort of meaty look. And people say, "Oh gosh, where you can eat your paint." You love to look at your paint. It's just, it's sort of luscious and rich. What happened eventually? I started using the paint as I did, and something happened. The paint that I put on, I was using dragging the paint over another. A ground paint painted, and the paint started lifting up the ground paint and mixing in. So if I black and I put white on, skim white paint on, and instead of just skimming on, it actually mixed. It dissolved the paint underneath it, and I thought, good heavens, they've changed the recipe. They've changed the recipe. So I thought, it's a different paint. It's still acrylic, but I have to change the way I work. So suddenly, my heavily impasto painting, which was very much a feature of my work for up to probably about 1994 or so, and then suddenly it stopped, and I had to use it very differently. I had to use a different kind of technique, which made the paintings look different, and I had to change the way I thought about painting. So these things happen to you, and so suddenly an outside influence can be very liberating, or it can be very inhibiting. So I thought, okay, that's it. So I went back to watercolour painting, reduced the scale, watercolours, and got back into new watercolours. And I had, that's what I'm doing at the moment, working a lot with watercolour on small scale. "40 years ago, I first went to Rakaumangamanga, which is a promontory. It's on the Cape Brett Peninsula. And it's made up of several conical features, and it's very isolated. It's very difficult to get to it by boat, or if you care to walk through the bush, you can get to it. But it's very, very remote area in the Bay of Islands. And my wife's family come from a place called Te Rawhiti, which is a small, I was going to say township, but it's not a township, it's just a small community, which has now grown quite considerably over the years. But 30 or 40 years ago, there were probably 3 or 4 families living in the area. Rakaumangamanga is a very sacred area to Maori, and it was the place where the first canoes landed, apparently, and then from there distributed the 7 or so canoes moved to the rest of the country. So the 7 hills represented, each became associated with one of the canoes. And from there, the whole of New Zealand was, so it was a really very important and very sacred place. I made a point of never actually standing on it. It was so sacred and so important that I felt I would be trespassing. At that point, I was really deeply engaged in what was happening because I thought, well, the landscape's very, very attractive. It's sort of rolling, undulating hills with features of occupation. After all, people have been living there for over 1,000 years, probably. But at that point, I really knew very little about the history of the local people or what it meant to them. People were concerned about cutting up their land. There were huge blocks, and the people wanted to put their houses in. And so I was partially able to assist them in surveying the land. So through the School of Architecture, I picked up information on how you surveyed land. I was taking photographs, and I started becoming interested in the landscape as a commodity, which was obviously very important to the people living there. So as I spent more time photographing and drawing, I started evolving notions about how to look at land. I looked at the land in quite a different way to Maori because the history of the place was embedded. I mean, everyone knew stories about the history of the land, who lived where, who killed, who died there, who was born there. And slowly I started building up my own sort of kind of ideas to what the land was. And it was, it had never been painted as far as I could see, or never been attempted, and no one ever attempted to do a serious job on the landscape. And I thought, well, with my newfound knowledge, I should be able to give a different kind of look to it. So the first thing was to map the land. So I was making a lot of maps and doing lots of calculations using a dumpy level and a theodolite, and looking at maps. So these kinds of things started to impinge on my paintings, as you can see in these little marks of measured sort of symbols which relate to the way you actually quantify land and land areas. Most of the problems which were arising living in these rural situations was land, what you did with your land, because Maori land was a very, very complex issue, and there was no road access to Rawhiti, and because the Bay of Islands County Council was very keen to open up areas for development on these beautiful beach properties, the rates started going up. And people were complaining because no single person would own a particular piece of land. It was made up of a number of shareholders. So you could have a 10-acre block and there might be 300 or 400 owners. And they'd all own a different share, a different proportion. So I might have a very small piece, I might have a big piece. It was never surveyed to that extent that you knew exactly where your property was. You were a shareholder in a block of land. And the person who had the biggest share was the person who received the rating notice. So it was up to him or her to find the money to pay the rates. And if you didn't pay the rates, the council could say, well, you're not paying your rates, we'll have to take some of your land and sell it to make, which means that the land was slowly being nibbled away. And it seemed quite an injustice. I mean, it changed later on, of course, but at that moment, a new road was proposed to go into Rawhiti and to the end of that particular piece of land, which was opening up, and with beautiful beach sections, which were very attractive to people living in Auckland, particularly, who were prepared to pay huge sums for this, living in this beautiful landscape. To get back to Rakaumangamanga, the series lasted probably about 10 years on and off, and then I moved on to other things as you work. For example, people talk about the imagery, the symbols which developed in the painting. Those come about through skirting around your topic. For example, you may be doing a landscape and you put in stars, and you think, what are the stars? And they think, how does the star relate to the culture? And you think, the Matariki, which is a festival at the beginning of the year, and that's when the star cluster of Pleiades of 7 stars appears on the eastern horizon. And there's an equivalent in the northern hemisphere. Stonehenge and most Greek temples are built so that when you're on the front, you look out and there's the Pleiades rising above the horizon. So I started getting interested in astronomy, and then of course you get into astrology, and people trying to divine the nature of being, the nature of being able to see the future and so forth by looking at the stars. So the whole idea of trying to evolve some knowledge as to what's going to happen in the future by looking at the stars. And it certainly, in the at night in Rawhiti, the sky is just black, and then when the stars come out, it's just unbelievable. It's a mobile fabric of things happening, of incident. And so I use stars, and I use the Pleiades a lot. And I use Uenuku as a symbol. I use a rainbow form. So you're skirting around, and by skirting around these topics, you pick up all sorts of other things which relate to painting. And painting is involved with creating symbols and images which tantallate the senses when you're looking at it, and suggest all sorts of things to you. I mean, no two people will read the same way, painting in the same way. Everyone's different. Everyone will see a painting in a different way. If it's not Rakaumangamanga, it'll be some other theme. So you take a theme and you build around the theme, and you introduce elements which are suggested. And it could be suggested by other painters. For example, Hans Holbein, one of my favourite paintings, which hangs in the National Art Gallery in London, is the Ambassadors. It's a huge painting of 2 figures, and in the middle is a construction, and it's covered with all kinds of instruments used to gauge time and space. There's one called a torquetum, which is a very strange. These people are highly intelligent, trying to work out methods of measuring the way the cosmos works, the way that planets rotate, and it's all there. So it implies that these 2 gentlemen, who are supposed to be ambassadors, have absorbed all this information and knowledge. There's a lute, there's some music, and it gives a fuller kind of rendition of what sort of people they are. And these are real Renaissance men. And I thought, well, I like that, and so I started looking at medieval instruments used to measure time and space, and I've introduced there's one called a torquetum, which I use. And people say, what's that? And I say, it's a torquetum. They say, what's that? And I show them, and they say, oh, that's interesting. Never thought of it, And that's why I like to introduce into my painting objects which are not immediately recognizable, but some of them do exist in fact, and they are instruments which are a result of man's imagination, and he fabricates these things to try and understand a deeper, more profound nature of his environment. I always go back to it whenever I go to England, I go to London, look at the Ambassadors, because I think this particular painting is like looking through a portal into another space. It's another time. It's just it's a huge painting, and it sort of fills your peripheral vision. So you're just standing there. It's just the 3 of you, looking at each other, and it's a real. I tell you, it gives me a real buzz.